Welcome to the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Right now, we're going through the entire Bible to understand it as one big, cohesive story. We're covering one book each day, and this one is about 2 Thessalonians.
We're going to talk about 2 Thessalonians in just a minute, but before we do, I thought of a trick that I use to keep straight all of these books that start with the letter T that are all clumped together in the middle of the New Testament. Every book that starts with the letter T is together in a row, 5 of them. And the way you can remember what order they appear in is that they're all alphabetical. 1st and 2nd Thessalonians is TH. 1st and 2nd Timothy, that's TI. And then Titus, which is also TI, is TITUS. So it comes last. Look at that. They're in alphabetical order. Now you'll always remember where all of the T books go and what order they appear in. 2 Thessalonians, though. We talked in our last conversation about Acts 17, where we get the story of how Paul founded the church in Thessalonica and the immediate challenges that he was confronted there and how their training was incomplete because Paul had to flee to keep from getting killed. So Paul moves on relatively quickly to Corinth, where he writes back a couple of letters to these Christians in Thessalonica. So the memory's still fresh for him of what's going on there. And it would appear that the two big problems that are facing the church in Thessalonica, problems Paul probably would have worked through with them in person if he'd been able to stay longer, are one, that they are becoming cultural outcasts because of how weird the way they live is compared with the way that the people of Thessalonica live. The people in that town just have completely different values sexually and in terms of family and in terms of how they do culture and relationships and money and generosity or lack thereof. They have a totally different way of coming at things, undergirded by a totally different set of assumptions than these new Christians do. And it's become very costly for them. So in 1 Thessalonians, Paul deals with a whole bunch of those concerns, but he also touches on the idea that things are going to be okay because you can live expectantly and with hope about the fact that Jesus is coming back. Things are not done. There's an end game to all of this era of the church, and your suffering is in keeping with the life of Christ, and it is not in vain. Well, that gets us in to the second thing that seems to have troubled the young Thessalonian church, and that is, well, that question of when. Okay, Jesus is coming back, you say, Paul. That's awesome. We're very, very for that. Sooner would actually be better. Things are not going very well here. We're under all kinds of pressure. And so what we see is the Thessalonians not being thoroughly briefed on how all of history is to unfold. They get into something that has been a very popular Christian pastime ever since, and that is speculation about facts and figures and charts and numbers and dates in the pursuit of a precise read on exactly when this ultimate day of the Lord is going to come and when Christ is going to return in the fashion that Paul described in 1 Thessalonians. So very quickly, after writing 1 Thessalonians, Paul is like, oh, dang, I heard some more stuff about what's going on there in Thessalonica. I got to write you 2 Thessalonians to help you out with what you're facing right now. But before we look at the structure of the book, just a quick side note. Think about what we learned back when we were talking about 1st and 2nd Corinthians and how difficult things were in that city. And now think about the fact that Paul left one type of very difficult situation in Thessalonica to go to a very different type of very difficult situation in Corinth. And he's trying to help the people in Corinth while he's also trying to write a letter to the chaos that's happening in Thessalonica. This guy had a hard job. He was doing something dangerously countercultural in very hostile territory and trying to think outside of the immediate context of the hostile territory he was in to help other Christians in other hostile territory that he was in. And so when we run into those passages in Paul's letters where he's pretty forceful, pretty direct, pretty quick about things, and pretty blunt, maybe even pretty impatient with bad ideas and destructive things, all of that stuff makes a lot more sense when you consider who he was and what he was doing. And the Bible never holds out Paul the man as being infallible. Christians don't believe that Paul or Peter or anybody was infallible. Everybody other than Christ has problems, has flaws, has sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, as is written in the book of Romans. And Paul is no exception. So the fact that we see the earnestness of his heart as he's tackling a lot of these situations, sometimes very bluntly and with a lot of rough edges, just speaks to the difficulty of this role. And like he was told by Jesus when he met the risen Christ on the road to Damascus, he was going to suffer a lot for this thing. And indeed, we see Paul as being a guy who is well acquainted with turmoil and difficulty. All right, back to the letter, though, of 2 Thessalonians. The first chapter of the book echoes the first half of 1 Thessalonians. This is Paul once again saying, hey, I cannot express properly how grateful I am to God for you and for your steadfastness, and that you're hanging in under difficult circumstances. You are a blessing. He just really props them up, and they deserve it because they're taking a beating and they are suffering in a way that has echoes of how Christ suffered. That happens when the kingdom you're loyal to isn't of this world. But Paul assures them that this reality that they're going through right now is not the ultimate forever reality. Then in chapter 2, Paul draws heavily on the language and style of language that Jesus uses in Matthew 24. That's the fifth of the 5 great big speeches around which the book of Matthew is built. Sometimes it's called the Olivet Discourse, and it's a speech that Matthew gave about how the future of things is going to unfold. Well, it makes sense that Paul would tap into that stuff from Jesus because that's one of the big questions the church in Thessalonica clearly had. And Paul talks about the arrival of this man of lawlessness. And here it's apparent that Paul has heard about some people in his name, in Paul's name, going out and saying, we missed it. The day of the Lord has already happened. We all got left. Things are very, very bad. We missed it. It's panic time. And Paul is like, no, I did not say that. That is not what you were taught. That is not what Jesus taught. And then once again, he leans into the words of Jesus by saying a bunch of world stuff is just going to happen. And that's the tone of the beginning of the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24. Jesus is talking to a group of people, his disciples, who are like, say, so when is all this going to unfold? Because we kind of want to know how to pace ourselves for this. Same questions the Thessalonians are asking. And Jesus is like, hey, there's going to be a bunch of stuff that happens. You're going to see crazy natural phenomenon, political phenomenon, violence, persecution. And in so many words, Jesus is telling his disciples, that is just the broken world doing stuff that the broken world is going to do. Those are no sure signs of the end of things or the day of the Lord or the return of the Son of Man. Just keep on in faithfulness. And then later in that 5th great speech around which the book of Matthew is structured, Jesus gets into stuff about like when we're really getting close to the time when the Son of Man, that's Jesus, is actually going to return. So Paul here says there's this man of lawlessness who has to come before any of this end of time stuff is going to occur. Some people who are real smart look at that passage and they're like, the man of lawlessness, that must be one particular character who is dangerous. Maybe it's like the Antichrist or some sort of Antichrist, a political leader, a military ruler. And many people throughout history have speculated, it's Hitler. It's King George III. It's the evil dictator of this place or that place. And all of that, timeline-wise, has turned out to be flawed speculation. So maybe the man of lawlessness is one dude who's going to come along who is just so genuinely horrible that he will initiate horrible, awful things in the whole world, and everybody will see it. And when you see that, you better get out of town if you can, because it's going to get ugly. Or maybe the man of lawlessness as a concept is an echo of what Jesus is talking about in Matthew 24, and that is the template, the archetype of puffed up, arrogant kings who imagine they control all of the world and control reality, but they don't. Maybe there's just a whole lot more general evil lawlessness like we see from some of the evil kings of the Old Testament who are humbled before God that has to happen and unfold. Smart people disagree on how much specificity should be read into that man of lawlessness thing, but the point is real straightforward. Paul is saying it hasn't happened yet. The rumblings that you're feeling are the natural consequences of the fallen, broken, sinful world world you still live in. Hold fast, stand firm, live expectantly and hopefully in light of the promise of Christ's return. And in so many words, he's saying your speculation is not particularly helpful, and it's not even in keeping with what Jesus taught. Paul said that in 1 Thessalonians, and Jesus said that explicitly in that same speech I keep referencing back to in Matthew 24 and 25. Well, then in chapter 3, we've got a problem that may be connected to the previous problems, and Paul needs to address it, or maybe it's unrelated, but I think it's connected to the previous problems. People quit working in the church. They weren't doing things like going to work and earning money in order to have food. Looks like they were just running around, running their mouths and being idle and not accomplishing things. And in light of what we see in the rest of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, I think it's pretty reasonable to conclude that they were doing so because they believed that the end of days, the day of the Lord, the return of Christ, had either already happened or it was going to happen like next Thursday. And we had it all figured out. We had charts and facts and figures, and we know how it's going to be. Whatever is prompting this idleness, it isn't in keeping with that expectant, hopeful living that Paul is exhorting them toward. And so he says, knock it off with that stuff. People should work. And Paul puts his money where his mouth is by pointing to the way he lived while he was there, saying, look, I worked while I was among you. I did stuff. I earned my keep. And implicitly, the question he's asking is, why would I do that if I secretly knew about the arrival of Jesus and the specific day of the Lord? I would have been coasting too. But my example isn't just because I'm the best guy ever. The reason I'm pointing to that example is because my conduct proves to you what I actually believe and received from Jesus, that the day of the Lord, the day of the return of Christ, is unknown. I feel bad for this little church. This is a tough draw for them, but I all the more respect their faithfulness, even from 2,000 years across the ages. I find it encouraging and challenging. They didn't know everything. They didn't have everything together. They were very much doing the walk by faith in Christ thing under very difficult circumstances. And Paul's trying to help them out from a distance. And one of the byproducts of all of that is that we get a couple of beautiful, if very succinct, books of the Bible that touch on some important questions that naturally Christians throughout the ages are going to ask. When you visualize the book of 2 Thessalonians, picture that man of lawlessness. When you think about the theme of 2 Thessalonians, reflect on that expectant, hopeful living as a right response to the coming return of Jesus versus the wrong responses to the coming return of Jesus that are out there. And finally, if you don't have time to read the whole thing, make sure you check out chapter 2. I'm going to ask my friend Jeffrey, who edits this podcast, to cue the level up sound right now as we anticipate 1 Timothy next time around. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.
This podcast is supported by many of you at patreon.com/the TMBH podcast. We're grateful because it supports our family.